in trying to comply with the judicial order of not moving not a single comma to the initiative presented by the executive branch to the legislative branch. But nevertheless, the political forces are not favoring the government. They do not have enough votes in order to promote the constitutional forum. This opens up opportunities so that we can talk about consequences, that we will talk about solutions and options of what this reform could be like. This is why we have organized this forum. Energy reform, yes, but not this one. Let me say to you that México Evalúa, we have been insisting for years in regards to the need of strengthening the energy sector, modernize this legal framework, with a long-term development vision for the country. We have been quite insisting, quite clear in the urgency of turning Pemex and CFE into companies that will be operating with efficiency, efficacy, and in a transparent way, and that will be rendered the best outcomes for all of us, their clients, the people of Mexico. We have drafted studies and proposals to help Pemex and CFE to have all the resources necessary to face climate change, the energy poverty in which many Mexicans live. The constitutional reform that is to be discussed today will not comply with these intentions or purposes, and it will not comply with the goals that it has to pursue. And let me say to you why. It will concentrate a tremendous amount of power at CFE by disappearing regulating entities created by the state without proposing good supervising mechanisms. It would weaken the electricity market by giving a monopolic power at CFE for it to use them with political control purposes. This is what I say. It will take back to the country to our past. In regards to the energy production, where we have international commitments and agreements in the environmental area, where we have had many consequences to our country, not only on the energy sector, but also economic. Now, this technological process for Mexico would stay back in regards to renewable energies through the lack of investment, unemployment, and growth, and many companies will not get here. And we would not be with other countries that are providing clean energies. It will be increasing the public expenditure that will be limited in regards to the needs to be of investment within the sector. So we are here to discuss, to analyze why this reform is not what the country needs, and in order to consider what is really positive for the country. For this, we have invited first level experts. Lila Bet will be introducing them as the co-host of this event, and she will be moderating the other tables. We have Mariana Campos, we have Cecilia Guillón, Tony Payan, Fusca Tocampo, Lisa Sierra, and Duncan, Vice President of Wilson Center. We hope that he will join us in this conversation. And well, finally, I believe that all of us that are participating in this forum, we would like to contribute to this point, because as I have said at this point, we are at a point of taking a decision regarding the future economic conditions of the country and the well-being of the country. I believe that if the reform and it is potential, given what I have said, will be a heart attack to our economy, well, the discussion will be if we will approve a series of impacts that will harm us considerably. Let me end up with this reflection. In the 60s, Mexico was not a sophisticated economy. We didn't get a lot of foreign investment then. We had 40 million in population, less than a third of the population that we have right now. We didn't have climate change. We didn't have renewable energies. And we believe that oil will last forever. That country that was present 60 years ago had it made sense to produce energy with political purposes and will be created by the state and produced by the state. Now we are in 2022. That's why we have to consider other solutions. That's why we say yes to the energy reform, yes to the energy reform, but this one definitely not. I thank you so much, and let us now start. And before we start with this first round table, Lila will be addressing us. We thank you, Edna. Good day to all of you. On behalf of the Instituto Mexico at the Wilson Center, it is a pleasure to welcome our excellent speakers this morning and those of you that are with us through remote means. Basically, we would like to thank Mexico Evalúa. Edna, once again, thank you, and the Baker Institute, Tony Payan. We thank all of you for your contribution in this event. Just to add to what Edna has said, the presidential initiative of the energy reform, for many, it represents an opportunity at the national level of consolidating an energy independence that will project the energy industry in the country at the international level. For many experts, the initiative is really a step back in the energy area and a constant danger not only for the environment, but also for the national economy that as a consequence will impact consumers. The proposal of the energy reform has created quite a series of problems and concerns with our important partners of Mexico and the United States. Our panel members will discuss why the energy reform will have environmental and economic negative impacts and will share concrete proposals to strengthen the governance of the energy sector, to establish better conditions or CFE in the market, and lead the country to solve the problems of this sector beyond the reform proposed by the President of Mexico. Let me remind our listeners that during today's event, we will have simultaneous interpretation. If you can click the globe in the lower part of your screen where you can select the language of your choice. And if you have any questions for speakers, you can direct them to us through our Twitter account, at Mexico Institute and Mexico at wilsoncenter.org. And having said this, Edna, if you allow me, we will start with our first round table of discussion regarding the cost of the reform and the possible effects of this reform. Our first speaker is Mariana Campos, coordinator of the program of public expenditure of Mexico Evalúa. She has quite a history as a consultant in design and evaluation of programs and public policies. Among them, we highlight different assessments of federal programs in the framework of the evaluation of performance of the federal government. Mariana, you're most welcome, and the floor is yours. I'm sorry, your microphone is off, madam. Thank you. Good morning. We thank Lila, and let me greet all of my colleague speakers and those of you that are connected online today. Let me share with you that my participation will be divided into three sections. I think I would like to approach first, which I believe to be the motivations for this reform from the point of view that I analyze, which are public finances, and that I deeply believe that this reform has a motivation in this area. I also will talk to you about the impacts, of course, that we are seeing. And finally, I would like just to outline what is it that I believe that an energy reform should include. First of all, let me say to you that the Mexican government is well known within its context for being a government that is not good in tax collection. Mexico is a developing economy and it's difficult for tax collection to have tax collections at the same level as developed countries. But we are comparing ourselves with our peers in Latin America when one sees which are the data that Mexico has along this line. It turns out to be that we can end up by saying that we have an economic poor government. This is not changing regarding whichever party is in power. Mexico is having 16% of its GDP and in Latin America is 26%. So we're missing 7 points of the GDP that we're not collecting in taxes. And what is the meaning of this? Well, it means that we have scarce resources within the administration in order to finance from the public policy Mexico's development. So this is making that the cost of opportunity of public money in Mexico is very high. The government has to consider seriously what is it we can fund and what we cannot fund in such a way to have a positive impact in the economic and social growth and development. Another quite relevant issue is that in this midterm administration, we made an analysis and we realized how CFE has become a problem for the public expenses. It has always been a burden in the public expenditure because the Ministry of the Treasury transfers a subsidy, but nevertheless, the situation at the Treasury since 2019, we had an economy that had a downsize given the pandemic while it was taking place in the world. And then with this impact of the pandemic, we had limited income. Now, this means that we have identified that the government had a very small growth in its income, very minor in comparison to the pressures that the pension fund has by the mid of this administration, but the only income that went down was that of CFE. So in total, the government managed to increase in 177 billion pesos its total income by the midterm of this administration. If we see the oil uh, income, they contributed with about 87 billion, the taxpayers 100, but CFE had 78 billion pesos deduction. Clearly, the government has become quite a burden for the current administration, and it has a logic because if we review the analysis of the company, what we have come across is that in 2021, the company had its worst financial balance that it has ever had in the last 30 years. So CFE is in a critical situation. They are desperate from the government in order to change the situation. Something that also called our attention is that in general terms, with the money uh, transfers that the Treasury sends to CFE during the FY, this is funded with resources from the taxes paid by taxpayers. The operational balance that normally is negative, traditionally speaking, became positive. So the financial balance is positive. What happened in 2021? It is the first year that this is not happening. It was not enough, the transfer that the Treasury had uh, budgeted for CFE. So I believe that behind this reform and this motivation, there is a desperate condition. Nevertheless, I believe that if we are not uh, facing it in the way that we should face it and solve it, because precisely this reform, at least in the midterm, sooner than later, will have a very negative effect in the uh, country's expenditure and its treasury. Now, let me talk about impacts. Here we come from a situation in which CFE is a generator of electricity that is very costly. In average, the cost of energy generation of CFE is twice the amount of private sector generation. So this reform, one of its main pillars, is precisely to give more market participation to CFE, because now the private sector has 62% of this participation, and CFE has lost its participation given the fact that with its market mechanism that started since the 2013 reform, we have privileged cost efficiency of the suppliers and the energy generation. So CFE has been staying behind. Now, this reform is trying to achieve in any way to provide CFE with more market participation. But this in practice is basically to raise the cost of energy generation in Mexico. And this is where there is a negative impact because this higher cost needs to be paid one way or another. We are seeing at this point that we will pay with either raising the fees or by a payment through a higher subsidy that the Treasury will give to CFE. There are different estimates about how these fees will be increased, but by reviewing that of the renewable energy sources that have to do with estimate, they consider that CFE, if it increases its market participation, they could increase the cost over 50%. The problem of this is energy is a key income of our economy. So this means that we will not only impact the energy sector by applying these type of measures, but it will have consequences within the different sectors. We will increase the cost of different projects that have embraced a specific energy generation cost. So this will have quite a contagion situation within the Mexican economy, and we will limit the economic growth. And as a result of this, it will be impacting the public finances because the tax income, the most important of the Mexican administration and most of the governments in the world, is up to the number of transactions of the size of the economy. So it is along this sense that the tax collection will be impacted sooner than later. And that is where I believe that the government is having an extremely short-term vision where we are not doing the right analysis of what it will imply to Mexico in the future. What will happen with a company that is going to be needing more subsidies? Why so? Because the fees is lower to their operation cost, to the cost of the generation of electricity. It will need more subsidies. It is going to have to go through different fees but the government will have less money for subsidies. This is where I see that services will be impacting. We're going to have perhaps a cut in the cost of services or low quality of the energy service. And that is concerning because once again, it will generate affectations to all of the productive processes. As a result of this, I believe that this reform will not only impact the uh, uh, growing the decisions, the investment and development decisions, it will take the Treasury to bankruptcy. So this is the size and the seriousness of the problem that we are now facing. Much has been said of the compensations, and the compensations are only a part of all of the economic compensation. And within these compensations, they have to do with the generation of contracts that will take place with the energy generation contracts in order to provide this market to CFE. And this has a cost that is about 44 billion to 85 billion pesos. In accordance to the sources of information, they are the ones that will be funding the project that will be estimated of those that have been estimating these amounts. And these billions of dollars that will become billions of pesos, well, obviously, they have to be paid from the budget. It will be having to do with a limited budget. This will be quite a strong blow for the public finances. This is not an amount that has to be paid within a specific year, but we will be uploading with this element and it will be a burden for the public expenditure for several years. Having said this, I have a first discussion in regards to the different impacts, and I will end up by saying that an energy reform will have to place in the first instance a strengthening of the public finances. I think that Mexico Evalúa and our institution were not against CFE. On the contrary, we certainly need a strong CFE. And then I do believe that we have to have a perspective regarding the problem that this company is facing that has lost a part of the market. It is not competitive, is not giving competitive fees, its costs are very high. So the focus of this reform has to be aimed to solve through a strategic and financial plan in place how we are going to be strengthening CFE. Of course, this plan has to have governance measures so the decision-making processes in regards to this company will be more effective, will privilege investment above the high costs of labor uh, liabilities that have been generated. I will be talking about this later on, but I thank you for your kind attention. We thank Mariana for sharing with us that complex scenario that can take place if the current energy reform is adopted.
De nuestros ponentes, de nuevo nos pueden enviar sus preguntas a nuestra cuenta
Let
de
me remind our attendants that you can send your questions to Mexico Institute or MexicoWilsonCenter.org. And having said this, we will now give the floor to Cecilia Guillon, Director of the Initiative Energy Transition at the Institute of the Americas. She's a consultant of solar projects in Latin America and energy efficiency in the United States. She has been involved in this sector for 18 years and public relations and financial administration within the private and public sector. Cecilia, you're welcome. Let me thank Wilson Center and México Evalúa for being invited to be a part of this important discussion and to share my perspectives, basically, of being with an international Japanese company that has plants in Tijuana and Santiago and Europe and other areas. And within my work in solar energy, working with clients such as Johnson and Johnson and multinational companies, there are those that see the issue of renewable energies now perhaps it's more important with climate change, but we've been talking since 2003 up to 2010, 2015, and our conversation had to do with the fact that renewable energies would be used in order to reduce costs, to have precise costs of the energy that was used within the manufacturing plants, etc. So what I want to establish here is the connection not only regarding energy as a relevant element. I liked Mariana's presentation because as she has shared with us within what is happening in Mexico. But I'm sharing with you about the danger that Mexico will lose the opportunity of about 100 billion, uh, $100 billion investment that are about to be directed to Latin America in order to bring uh, manufacturing plants from Asia to this continent. So then my perspective here is purely economic, if you want to see it this way. Last week, as a matter of fact, I was in Mexico at a forum regarding challenges and opportunities of the productive sector in Mexico, organized by the Economy Commission, uh, Trade and Competitiveness of the lower house. There was a very high level dialogue with representatives from all of the political parties and also representatives of the primary sector, such as food, agribusiness, and secondary sector, steel, petrochemical industry, and also the manufacturing industry participated. Within this forum, there was a reference to the urgency of having a growth in our economy. Mexico is behind in regards to productivity. The Competitiveness Mexican Institute published the index, competitiveness index at the national level, and in comparison with other 23 countries, Mexico from 2020 to 2021 went from the 35th position to the 37th position. We know that the pandemic has impacted the whole world, but we have to consider that Mexico has gone down in the ranking while other countries under the same conditions have gone up. Now, at this moment of our story, Mexico has an opportunity, a golden opportunity of speeding up its economic growth. That its neighbors, the United States and Canada, are looking for ways to bring um, manufacturing plants from Asia to North America. Mexico has been a very reliable partner for international manufacturers, not only from the United States, but also from Europe, Japan, and Korea. Now, the office of President Biden issued a communique in February that expresses the interest of working with members of USMCA to ensure the value chain of strategic products, the context of onshoring, local manufacturing, and nearshoring, Mexico and Canada, and ally shoring, that is the manufacturing of countries, are the ones that we're using when the United States is talking about bringing the value chain from Asia to the Americas. The challenge that Mexico has, and this was mentioned by all of the speakers at the forum last week, could be national and also international. But for Mexico to be competitive, we need internal investments in education and technology, manufacturing, infrastructure. And what everyone said unanimously is that we need a competitive energy, transparent market, clean energies, reliable and accessible energy. Most of the international companies have to comply with decarbonizing their supply chains, and the relevance of clean energies has been highlighted with the Ukraine war. I mean, you have heard within the news for Europe, basically, it is urgent to limit its dependence of hydrocarbons that are of imported nature. We have to remember that while Mexico is exporting oil, Mexico also imports refined fuel and natural gas, and also fuels that almost all of the countries in the world have planned that by in the mid or the long term to get rid of them. Now, in order to do this, we need to change the transportation system to electric vehicles and others that would not use for them to use clean fuels such as hydrogen and other green sources of energy. You have seen that most of the car manufacturers are already planning that they will be switching the manufacturing of cars to electric cars. Now, where are they going to be manufacturing them? Now, also, the United States is now promoting that these products will be manufactured on this side of the world. We're talking of over $70 billion that could be directed to Latin America under the new shoring and ally shoring scheme. Now, the window of opportunity of Mexico in order to bring a good amount of these investments can be uh, narrowing if Mexico is canceling contracts that have been granted and it's closing its energy competitiveness together with the opportunity of increasing the production of renewable energies. Let me share with you an example of two uh, companies. One of them is Intel, that is investing almost $1 billion in Costa Rica, a country with almost 100% of renewable energies, and with a commitment signed by the president of Costa Rica shortly ago to reach 100% of renewable energies by 2050. Intel is building an assembly plant and also extending the R&D center. This is quite interesting because they had R&D in Costa Rica, and the assembly, well, it was done in Guadalajara, Mexico. In Guadalajara, we didn't carry out the same investment. It was limited. It was interesting to see that now they're seeing how to assemble this in Costa Rica. The company is investing billions of dollars in the United States, and Intel has the target of using 100% of its energy produced by renewable energy sources. An Australian company also in February or January signed an MOU with the president of Costa Rica in order to review the opportunity of investing $3.3 billion in order to produce green hydrogen. A representative of the company said that Costa Rica was selected for this project because it has political stability, highly trained labor force, and because it's producing renewable energy at a very low prices. We have to take note of this because that is what the companies are looking for. They're not going to get to a market where they will not have legal certainty. Well, they don't know if they will be producing energy and at what cost the production will take place. It is a pragmatic, not a political decision that is impacting the business sector. Now, it's not that I want to compare Costa Rica with Mexico. Of course not. But I want to do is to demonstrate the qualities that are attracting investors. Mexico has a highly skilled labor force. I know these personally because I was born in San Diego and I have been working uh, in different areas where they have semiconductors, clean areas. Mexico at this point is there without changing anything. Mexico is quite attractive for the clean batteries and all of the other products that are being manufactured can be done at the border or beyond. We have Guadalajara, Querétaro, and where we have had considerable investment in the high-tech sectors. Now that the rules of the game are including decarbonization and low clean energy costs, Mexico is not sending the right signs or signals to attract investments, unfortunately. It is quite frustrating because everything lies there. The opportunities are there. The labor skill is there. And I hope they're not going to be short. An environment with threats to the regulatory certainty and being respectful of contracts already signed are elements that investors do not like to invest or to make their manufacturing plants grow unless they have the certainty. So I hope Mexico will take advantage of this incredible opportunity of participating in the nearshoring, and the reducing the level of investment in clean energies, as Marina has explained. I can say now to Marina, well, this is the way in which we can change what you have said regarding the losses that Mexico has had. This is the moment, and truly I hope that Mexico will take this opportunity seriously. Thank you very much. What you have mentioned is very relevant because the issue of renewable energies is a pillar of President Biden in its foreign policy, and the uncertainty, the legal uncertainty that Mexico is presenting at this moment is actually taking away this investment. It's one of the very important factors that need to be taken into account for the possible approval of the energy reform. Having said this, we go now to Tony Payan, Director of the Centro Mexico of Public Policies at the Rice University. He's a professor of social science of the independent University of Ciudad Juarez. He's been a teacher at Texas University in El Paso for 14 years. He's focusing in the border region between Mexico and the U.S. Tony, most welcome. Well, it is a pleasure to be here with you, with Edna of México Evalúa, and also with the Wilson Institute. I thank you for being invited. I would like to elaborate in regards to the topic of Mexico's position in the world and the opportunity that the Mexican government is letting go, as Cecilia was mentioning a moment ago. As long as the energy sector in Mexico is now uh, covered by an ideology, a nationalism that seems to be very important to understand this. I fully understand why it is important to have perhaps a state-owned company or that will participate in a competitiveness field that will be broader. In the United States, we call them utilities. These is those services and goods that the market cannot supply fully, and then the state is going to be participating, but within a management market in regards to the competitiveness of the country, in regards to the different utilities. I fully understand this area or this component. Finally, there are a lot of people that live in rural areas that we can see, for example, this in other areas, that unless there is a public investment, these people are left without services, or they're left with a deficient service because most of the companies are focused in the major markets. Consider, I fully understand this argument, fully, but this proposal is not responding to this argument. The intention is to reconcentrate fully the energy sector into the hands of the government. We can see that in this point, given the characteristics of this sector, the government does not have the technological nor the capital to supply all of the market, a very complex market that needs to consider different elements from the rural to the urban area, and also industrial, residential, etc. So I think that the proposal really is not broad enough as to consider the capacity of being able to respond to all of the needs of Mexico. It actually narrows them, and it deprives Mexico of an important competitiveness. I think that energy is misunderstood in Mexico coming from the proposal. Electricity is not an ending. Of course, it is an element. It's a mean to achieve a purpose. So the infrastructure, now we talk so much about goods and services, but many of these goods and services are on top of an infrastructure, in this case, the energy infrastructure, so the rest of the economy can operate. This is for ports, airports, electricity, dams, water supply, etc. What gives competitiveness to a country is the fact that these sectors upon which the economy is moving will be competitive, efficient, and with enough investment and the technology to move forward in accordance to the needs of the future companies that are committed with decarbonization in in their productive activities. Now, let me refer more specifically to Mexico's position in the world. I also do consider that Mexico is letting go a very important opportunity. At this moment, what we see, apart from a sector that calls for a tremendous investment to update its infrastructure, to diversify the production sources of electricity, and to reach a resilient uh, network and grid that can distribute electricity and the amounts needed. For example, in Texas last year, we had the issue of the energy grid in Texas that collapsed itself given a summer storm. And we need an extraordinary capital investment. And Texas, with all of its resources, which is an economy bigger than Mexico, has not been able to face this because they know that they need an extraordinary amount of capital to make that the energy grid will be resilient enough. And I consider that Mexico and the resources are just not being there or nor allocated. What is happening? We're talking about reshoring and nearshoring, green, and also ally shoring. Mexico can be competitive with other countries such as Costa Rica that can offer an energy, more modern infrastructure, more uh, amicable with energy changes and climate change, but also with the United States. But when we talk about the electric manufacturing plants that will be established in the United States, being in Querétaro, Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, Monterrey, but also the states of the United States will be part of this competition. So Mexico is now competing not only with plants that will come back to North America that could somehow be responding to the strategic purposes of the United States in regards to China, but also the possibility of what they're going to be doing in Tennessee, Texas, Alabama, and to compete by offering conditions and infrastructural and tax incentives that are quite attractive and that must be reconsidering is the position of Mexico with the world, but also its position in regards to North America. I believe that Mexico can leave behind a lot of growth here on the table. It is not fully certain that all of the Chinese companies will come back to North America. They can go to other countries that will provide appropriate conditions. But obviously, the intention of the United States, in accordance to China's action in regards to the Russian-Ukrainian war will be very important. At this moment, China and all of the conversation regarding the reality of the world is now marked by the war. Washington is focused basically in Mexico, but the Chinese are considering clearly which is their situation, their condition, and they clearly know that that if they have to be carefully selecting on which side they're going to be. So this is why the Russians cannot get a lot of elements on the way. But this rivalry will come back, and this is where Mexico should think about electricity not as an ideological purpose, but actually, or not as an ending, but actually as a mean to attract investments. We're seeing a series of movements already within the relocation of the manufacturing from China to Mexico. I travel every 2 weeks to Ciudad Juarez for, I can see a maquila boom. What I'm considering a concern in Tijuana, Nogales, Reynosa, and Tijuana, what I can see, it is still a first assignment maquila. What are we bringing to Mexico? We're going back to a maquila model of the 90s because the competitiveness of Mexico will give no more room. Mexico needs to reposition itself in order to attract manufacturing of third, fourth levels in terms of the allocation of functions by bringing simple uh, in terms of services with the current infrastructure in Mexico, given the limited resources and given the limited technology and given the commitment with the hydrocarbon energy sources, it will not position Mexico in order to attract these type of industries that we finally need. Let me also mention that in Mexico, we have seen in Ciudad Juarez and in major regions of Mexico, there have been blackouts that have covered major regions in Mexico. Something is not right with the energy grid in Mexico. We will need a tremendous amount of investment only to modernize it and update it. Then I do believe that the Mexican government has the capital enough to invest when many of resources are being deviating to social services, obviously needed and indispensable, but that also undermine resources that are limited and not directed from one sector to another one. And unless we consider private investment, I think that Mexico is not investing what needs to be invested for this purpose. The type of strategies I believe that Mexico needs to conclude is mainly a mixture where perhaps they will have the participation of public utility, which is the CFE, but also we will have members of the private sector and that the state will take its hands off of the CFE and they will become a regulator. So they will say that this company, I'm not talking about its privatization, I'm talking about its efficiency in the administrative management so it can invest and it could be a part of many contests and be participating under the same or equal conditions as those of the private sector in the whole chain production and distribution line. Now, this energy reform is not doing this. On the opposite, it is actually tying the hands of the country in competitiveness, and it is limiting Mexico's future capacity of being able to become attractive for those companies that could be re-attracting its manufacturing to North America, competing with different states and areas of Canada and the United States, but it's also tying Mexico hands to provide to the Mexican people what they need. And we have seen many events of blackouts as in Ciudad Juarez. For example, if at my home, if we actually have energy goes off, I have to reprogram my CCTV and all of the security issues and all of the devices at home. So to pretend that the Mexican government can fund the whole modernization and the advancement of new energies, it is really not but an illusion. And I think this is contained given ideological reasons in this reform. We need a far more flexible grid, more resilient, and this resilience has to do with the participation of the state, of course, and the investment as a regulator, but with this distancing of CFE and the Mexican state and a more solid electric sector. If not, Mexico will not reposition itself, taking advantage of this opportunity that that the Chinese problems with the United States, given the war of Russia and Ukraine, and that keeps. Uh, but I'm sure that this situation will be present again once the Russian and Ukraine war is over, and Mexico could have lost an opportunity of creating an effective legislation that will be sending the correct signals to international companies of attracting to Mexico not only investment within the sector, a sine qua non condition for growth, but also the right signals for those that could be a part of this infrastructural network in order to have the right levels of production in the country, you know. And President López Obrador said something this morning. Maybe we should make some adjustments. We have to review this. I hope that he has said this seriously. Obviously, many of us would know that we have doubts that they could change their mind overnight, but I hope he had been honest and open and being motivated, because he's not sees clearly, as Edna has said, that it doesn't have enough votes, and maybe this is considering a different model to the one that this law contains. So my conclusion, therefore, is yes, we need changes within the sector to invest, to make it more competitive, and to make it more agile. But this is not the reform that complies with those functions. Tony, we thank you so much for the opportunities that we may lose for Mexico, not only within the North American region, but taking into account the major rivalries and the processes that are taking place at the international level. Now we will continue with our session of Q&A. We have about 10 more minutes, Edna, if I'm correct, so our speakers can respond to the different questions that we have received from our attendants. And the first question, and we kindly ask you to please be brief in your answers, given our time constraints. Your presentations have been very interesting, so I ask of you to be concise. The first question is directed to Mariana. We're now discussing at the Supreme Court a ruling to determine the constitutionality of a reform to the Electric Act. If it is approved by the ministers, which would be the implications not only for the electric sector, but the whole energy sector? What will be a positive vote outcome given by the Supreme Court? I believe that the votes of the Supreme Court, if they dismiss all the amparos that have been presented, the habeas corpus will be catastrophic in several senses, not only in this sector that we are concerned with, but I think that the court would be sending a signal that is really not independent. I think it would open up the space, or it would prepare the context to have a constitutional provision of the reform that the president submitted to the Congress. I think it is very important what the Supreme Court will decide today. I believe that the signals for foreign investors could be quite important also, because we know that in Mexico, to comply with contracts has always been an issue. Our rule of law is weak. This is how we are ranked in the measuring indexes, but there's always a hope. Always the Supreme Court as the highest justice court in the country has always had a trust in its objectivity, that it has a quality level and the effectiveness in their work higher than the ordinary courts. But I believe that with this situation that we will have soon, this could change. There have been some symptoms in different areas and reasons that I have no time to describe, but they have made us have doubts about the Supreme Court, and this will have to do with the impact of the rule of law, however limited it is, in something that is quite relevant, not only to solve this issue regarding the energy reform, but basically in the rule of law in Mexico. And it has to do with the decisions of this high instance. Cecilia, there's a question for you in regards to the fact that the issue that foreign investments will not get to Mexico, given the possible approval of the energy reform. But the foreign companies that already have current investments in the energy sector in Mexico, we expect that we will have many international arbitration processes against the Mexican government. Well, they have already started. And in regards to the companies that are already in Mexico, I believe that what can take place is that they will simply stop investing. They will invest in other places. They will strengthen their different plans. They will continue modernizing the ones they have. And in a given moment, they will not use them anymore. But whatever happens, I believe that if the reform takes place, many, many claims will be taken to the court.
Muchas gracias, Cecilia. Y esta es una
We
pregunta.
thank you, Cecilia. And this is a question. I will start with Tony Payan. This is an interesting question, though somehow difficult to respond. But if you could replace only a part of the current proposal in the energy reform, which is the component that you will change, and what would you use to optimize the positive economic impacts of this reform? How will you compensate it? I think that the core element, the crux of the issue, is private investment. If Mexico will not open its private sector investment, being dedicated to strengthen also CFE and its impacts, I think that will be the main mistake. Mariana made the right mention. The subsidies to gasoline, for example, are taking an enormous percentage of the federal budget, and the energy sector is also taking these subsidies. And this percentage means that we have a certain amount of allocated resources and how we can redirect them to try to maintain an inefficient energy sector with distortions means to sacrifice, obviously, investments in education, in health, and other sectors. So the private participation is an indispensable action. If there's anything else I should add to, well, for me, when the energy reform took place in the 2013 and 2014, it was very important. And at that moment, Pemex success will be when it will not be a part of just investing in Mexico, but start investing in other countries. So it will be truly an international company. I think this is part of the CFE. It could be an important managed and ruled company as a state-owned company, but separated from the state, in, but with a governance system that is finally imposed by the state. These are critical elements for our future. We thank you so much. We have one more question. Edna, are we okay for one more question or shall we continue? Last question. We have one more question, Lila. Our last question, and once again, it is also directed for Mariana. How could this reform impact the electoral cycles? Do you believe that it will become a trend? So the future presidents will propose their own energy reform, and which are the effects in the rule of law? I believe that this reform is going to have impacts sooner than the government is considering. It is already having impact. The foreign investment has been dropping in the energy sector in relevant ways. And if this reform is approved, I don't think we will have no time to think about electoral cycles. I believe that the economic condition of the country with the economic recovery that we had last year, that is opening uh, a void in the public finances where we had not have a problem as the one that we are seeing right now. I think we don't have much time. I believe that even in a previous fora where I also shared with Tony, I was saying that I think that this reform will not be implemented in time. That is the level of my consideration. I believe that this reform, we should focus in the real problem to strengthen CFE that is going to be less expensive than destroying the energy sector. Hopefully it will not be adopted. I hope that this is not going to be an
Muchas
example because
gracias,
it will be
Mariana,
very
Cecilia,
negative.
Tony,
We
Ana
thank
Lilia, por
Mariana, Cecilia, Tony.
estas
It has
perspectivas
been a
adicionales
pleasure
sobre la
to
reforma
hear your
energética con
perspective,
la
your analysis regarding
experiencia
the
de
energy
todos y
reform.
yo
And
también
I'm certain that our
escuché
attendants have
sus
learned a
mensajes
lot
esta
from
mañana.
your different
Muchísimas
presentations
gracias,
this
Lila,
morning.
por
We
tu
thank you so
participación.
much for being with us today.
Lila, bueno, pues pasamos a la segunda mesa.
Well, we now go to our second roundtable, and we want to share with you that there are so many ideas in my mind. We have opportunity of sharing these at the end, but there is a political component. All of the technical arguments are quite obvious. What we need to solve a political problem that Tony has expressed and all the different speakers. There's an ideology, a political, historical component. So to find the way to put the square as a circle is quite difficult. Not only technical elements, but how we can untangle this knot, but how we can strengthen CFE so this reform will not be just rescuing it and will lose our country along the way. So let's move on with our second roundtable. Our dear Lila will be once again leading and moderating this roundtable. Uh, Duncan has not been able to join us,
Pues sí, me tendrán que
but
aguantar un
well,
ratito más,
you're going to have to hold a
Hablando
bit
del
more.
ratón,
But
Duncan
I
ya
have just talked
está
to
listo para
Duncan, and
sumarse.
he's
Pero
just
si me
about to
permiten,
join us.
tal vez
So
en
if
esta
you allow me,
en esta
maybe I can
dinámica,
start the
y si
second,
Duncan se suma con
and then
nosotros,
if
pues
Duncan
él se
joins
va a
in,
integrar ya
we
a
can
este
integrate
roundtable.
him to
Pero bueno,
this
quiero
event.
dar la bienvenida a nuestros ponentes de nuestra
Let
segunda
me
mesa
welcome our speakers
sobre
of the
la
second
agenda
roundtable
la
that has to do
competitividad con
with
sostenibilidad.
competitiveness, with
Creo que son los factores,
sustainability.
Edna, que
It
acabas
is
de
one of the
mencionar,
factors,
también
Edna,
mencionaron
that you
nuestros
have mentioned,
panelistas,
and
y que
also
es
our
súper
previous speakers,
importante
and that is
para
so very
nosotros
important
discutirlo el día
for
de hoy.
what we're
Vamos
discussing
a
today.
iniciar
We
esta
will
segunda
start
mesa
this
con
second
Ana
table
Lilia
with
Moreno,
Ana Lilia
coordinadora de
Moreno,
la
coordinator of the
Coordinación de
Program
México
of
Evalúa.
Regulation
Se
in
desempeñó
Mexico Evalúa.
previamente
She
en
has acted
Senior
as manager,
Consultoría en
senior
temas
of
de
consulting
transferencia y
of
planeación fiscal
transfer
por 13
companies and
años en
tax planning
KPMG
for
y
3 years,
Deloitte.
KPMG and Deloitte.
Bienvenida,
Ana
Ana
Lilia,
Lilia.
you're most
Ahora sí que
welcome.
te cedemos
And
la
well,
palabra.
the floor is yours, Ana Lilia.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very
Déjenme ver
much.
si
Let me
puedo
see
compartir
if
la
I can
pantalla
share my
en algún
screen
momento
in a
con
given
el
moment
público.
with our
Eh,
audience.
muchas gracias, Lila. Es un gusto estar
Lila,
aquí
thank you
con
very
todos
much. It's a
ustedes.
pleasure to be here with all of you.
Quisiera
Let me
también agradecer
also
a mis
thank
compañeros del
our
IMCO, de
colleagues
Política
from
Climática,
INCO, from the
que van a
Climate
participar en mi
Initiative.
mesa.
I
Es
will
un
be
gusto de
sharing
verdad
with
estar
whom
con
I will
ustedes.
share this roundtable. It's a
Em,
pleasure to
para
share
mí,
this table with you.
esta
For
palabra
me,
representa
this
algo muy
roundtable
importante
represents
porque
something very
esta
important because
iniciativa
this
de
initiative
reforma
of
eléctrica
energy reform
está muy
is
enfocada
highly
en
focused
socavar los
in
mecanismos del
undermining
mercado,
the
los
market
mecanismos que hacen el
mechanisms
costo
and
energético
those
al sistema
mechanisms that
eléctrico
make the
nacional.
energy
Y
national system
esto
cost
es
efficient.
preocupante
And this is
en el sentido
concerning
de que
in the
la manera
sense
en
that
que
the way
podemos
in which
lograr
we may
la
achieve lower
competitividad
prices and
y la asequibilidad de la
the
población
accessibility of
a
the
la energía,
population
en este caso la
to
eléctrica,
energy, in
de
this
manera
case,
continua y
electricity,
con
in
mejor
a
calidad
continuous way and with
y
better quality
tecnológicamente
and
mejor,
technologically
pues
more
depende
modern.
mucho de los
Well, it's
mecanismos
up
que
to the
utilicen para
mechanisms that we will be
conseguirlo.
using in
Entonces,
order to do so.
previa a
So
esto,
I have
quisiera
called
resaltarles
this
de estos
presentation
mecanismos
the advantages
con
of
el fin
these
de transmitir
mechanisms
un
with the
mensaje
intention
a
of
nuestras
sending a
audiencias
message to
de
our
manera educativa, pero
audience
también informativa,
in order to
de por qué
propose and
sería
explain
importante
why
mantener
it will
estos
be important
mecanismos
to
en el
retain
sistema
these
eléctrico,
mechanisms
sobre todo
within
en el
the
país.
system for the
Aquí
benefit of the whole
tenemos
country.
mapitas
Here I've
de
taken a couple
posibilidades
of
en el
maps.
programa
of Protener, which is the sectorial energy program of our federal government. And as you may see in the first map, you can see all of the CFE electricity plants that combine the hydroelectric plants that have been a part of the public discourse, and also the thermal energy plants, and a series of technologies that integrate the whole energy matrix that are publicly owned. This is relevant for this conversation because the initiative of reform of President López Obrador and all of the energy policy that he has recently developed by the federal government, well, it sets forth changes from a ownership policy of energy. In the lower map, what we can actually see is the matrix integrated by the private sector. And what we can see here is basically that this ownership is divided in different types of energy technologies. There is a hydroelectric privately owned company, but what we can see here is that we have a lot of thermal energy sources. These are promoted by the hydrocarbons, and they are the ones that are known as dirty energy sources. Some of them are filthier than others. We have the carboelectric, or we have combined cycles, or the turbo gas, and we can see here an interesting distribution of wind energy and solar energy sources. So if we bring together all these two maps and we put them together, we have the full energy matrix in the country that at present does satisfy the demand. Now, the energy is difficult to store. We haven't reached that level of technological change. So the energy, as in it is disposed throughout the system, as when we're trying to comply with the demand in normal terms, it's done minute after minute, and the planning is done in a centralized way from the state, and also it is transported through natural monopolies of their broadcast that is contained. They are contained within our constitution. What are we seeing before us? Changes of important paradigms. Now, our history has within it a entanglement of or scaffolding of legislative struggles and judicial processes, as we can see within the courts, even at the national parliament, which is part of our history as a country. In 1960, for example, we nationalized the energy sector, and it went up until 1992 when a partial openness of the system took place, and we have come to 2008 with a policy focus in the energy transition promoted by laws that were promoting renewable energy sources and transition, but within the same legal framework, with the old obsolete framework that could not be updated given political motivation, because it didn't have enough votes at the Congress. And it was achieved in 2013 with an energy industry and an industrial organization that is shown here on this image as how it was organized through a spot market in the short term, auctions in the mid and long term, where here we set prices in order to provide the system with stability and also to satisfy the demand and to dispatch the energies in accordance to their nature and cost. By this way, we can achieve efficient prices. Let us recall that when the 2013 reform took place, they promised that prices would go down. And that was the expectation that political communication managed. And it seems to be that it was not right as a strategy, because for the market to mature and for the prices to go down, we need time. We need being persistent in our policies. We need transparency and a constant supervision of the system. So we're just a few years after the fact that this process, so we cannot see these obvious outcomes. This has generated political movement, expectations, despair, urgency, as Mariana was mentioning. And what we have before us is in itself an energy policy and a economic policy, even because they're both connected, more focused on the state. of getting away from the market, all the functions that have been attributed to it in 2013, and bringing back to the state-owned companies and the state control the functions of ruling and controlling the system. Now, one of the issues that I'm concerned with the most is that has to do with cost efficiency. What will the reform that we currently have on the table destroy? The wholesale market, the economic dispatch. This is how energy flows through these technologies in the grid. The auctions that are highly efficient mechanisms in order to have low stable prices in the short and midterm. And also the regulation of fees will be separated from the regulator. The regulator will disappear. Basically, they at CFE will be in charge of deciding which fees they are to be collecting. And this is not happening in most of the countries where they have energy systems, even vertically integrated and even state-owned. There's always an energy regulator, which is different from the company that decides the fees in order to avoid conflicts of interest. So what is it we're facing? Well, we are before a situation in which we can see this pie, where we can see the whole system. CFE currently supplies 38% of the energy, and the private sector, 2/3, as we can see. They are divided into 3/3, and the wholesale energy market is very small, only 15% of the whole system. This is where we can see that maturity is missing. The auctions were suspended during this administration, and we have data that are quite interesting. The trigger of the energy wholesale market is kind of like independent audience that watch that the auctions for the long term favored the reduction of operation costs in assessing and megawatt by hour in 57% between 2015 and 2017. The megawatt per hour was at $32 and it went down to $13.22. This is the wonder of the market that we can realize. And I don't want to see quite neoliberal, but I'm a fan of the market mechanisms. Non-centralized administration or centrally planned can achieve a reduction of costs at such a quick pace and so efficient, because here we can see the map of Mexico and ownership, if you recall the first slide, where you can see that the introduction of renewable energies connected with the public policies of 2018 and 2012, more or less, promoted these investments. So this is how we have our pie, independently of the ownership. This is how we are nourishing our energy. Now, this graph, I like it very much. Let me recognize Eleazar Castro, our researcher that helped us to create this graph. It's very difficult to manage this. Now, the purple circles represents the costs of current interconnected uh, contracts. These are the ones that are operating with the old system. They are our legacy. This is a transition moment where our system, we have the coexistence of the old systems and the new systems that came up after the reform of 2013. Now, let me go to the end of the presentation, and I will explain to you why we are at this moment in this circumstance in Mexico that is so radical. And as we can see on this graph, the purple circles remain being very relevant in the performance of our industry. And as we have seen, 38% of the energy is supplied through CFE. Now, the orange spots are the ones that have to do with the long-term auctions. This mapping has to do with costs. I can see the difference between the cost of the auctions when we have introduced a mechanism of cost efficiency within the market, and you can see the difference with the upper circles, the bigger ones that do represent the costs of the old contracts that are still operating. So that means that our market, in order to mature, calls to migrate all of these contracts and schemes of the old system to the new system, to the wholesale electric market. why this is important and why it triggers a lot of controversial issues and all of the friction that we are having now among the different political situations. Well, because the self-supply elements were an element that came up in the 90s as a design to overcome the lack of infrastructure that we had in Mexico and the lack of possibility of investing with public money in modern infrastructure that will place our country at the level of international trade when we entered first GATT and then the free trade uh, agreement. Became a part of the OECD and we signed endless uh, trade agreements. The only way to achieve this was through private sector investments in a legal framework with which we considered that trading of the private sector was illicit and because it had to do with a public service. So this is the ancient, the old paradigm. What happened with this supply? The self-supply are the plants that are directing energy to an endless number of companies that are currently 14% of the GDP. We have banks, we have telecommunications, we have companies dedicated to the foreign trade, wholesalers, manufacturing. So we do have an industry connected to the self-supply system that are operating separated from the market. So this has generated anomalies that I consider quite pertinent. That means that by having the self-supply plants, we cannot strengthen the wholesale market in the energy sector. So we have two plants that are operating at the same time that are not interconnected. The 2013 reform decided that these schemes will remain until they will be due. So when we came to this administration, President López Obrador promoted this reform to the energy system that is now discussed at the Supreme Court. So these contracts were to be reviewed. And if they were fraudulent, they were to be dismissed and canceled because we assume that these are countries that are deceiving the system and the government. This is the premise of the current administration. Now, the constitutional reform was more aggressive. And then it said, you know what, we're not going to review anything within the implementation of the reform. All the self-supply processes will be canceled, and the CFE will not be considering this nor buying it. And we're talking about 12% of the current generation. So what is the intermediate proposal? The intermediate proposal that was recently presented by the opposing groups to the current federal group is that we will migrate these contracts. Now, the new proposal is not telling us how. So ourselves, considering the COFESE opinion that I recommend that you will read it. The COFESE opinion was published a month ago. I recommend its reading, and we consider that it is pertinent to migrate through an auction in the midterm. That means let us take advantage of the sufficient mechanisms that we have within our system without changing the constitution, and let us migrate all of the self-supply processes through a market mechanism that will facilitate considerably the reallocation of the charging centers, which have to do with all of the demand. What will this be allowed through? That in a term from 3 to 6 months, all of the self-supply contracts will migrate to the market, will redefine the supply and demand, and basically the same market will solve and settle the appropriate and correct prices for each contract. This, what it will facilitate is through a market mechanism, we will be able to solve a problem that is quite concerning the current administration and CFE, and we recognize it's an anomaly to have two systems operating at the same time that have with different regimes. It is not only causing governance problems, so it is pertinent to recognize that this is a problem that needs to be solved. So it needs not to change the constitution, just to take the mechanisms we have in place and put them in place in a midterm auction for contracts that could last from 1 to 3 years and that could be operated directly by the Senate. Now, Senase. Now, who could migrate to this new wholesale electric market? The self-supply, obviously, also the purchases of CFE. Now, given the fact that CFE and SENER are anchored in a
policy of market mechanism. The long-term auctions were closed and canceled. So CFE has to overcome the problem of providing us with energy. So a fourth of the energy comes from this market that is highly volatile. And now this represents an important risk that could also be mitigated with this mechanism. So now the independent producers of energy that unfortunately have been able to talk to you are private producers that give energy to CFE only, and they come also from the old system. They also could migrate. So 31% of the purchases. Now the qualified supply, that are the companies that currently are operating within the modern plants. This is like a summary of how we could take advantage of the market mechanism and to provide it with a virtuous circle and to revindicate it, which has been highly attacked in recent moments. I thank you for your kind attention. We thank Ana Lilia, and I have news for you that Duncan Wood is now a part of our event. So he will join this conference and he will be moderating this panel. If you agree to this, Edna. But of course, Duncan, welcome. I mean, Lila, you were wonderful. It's a pleasure to have you in opening this event and moderating the first roundtable. We would like to keep on contributing with the Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute. Dear Duncan, hello. It's a pleasure. Let me thank Lila for her leadership of this event. I had the opportunity of listening to most of the presentation given by Ana Lilia. And let me say to you that it is wonderful to see at this point that we have panel members that are younger with a wonderful gender balance in this area that had uh, old men prevailing in this system. And what we can see is a generation change that under my personal view is wonderful. Now, the next panel member is Oscar Ocampo. He is founder and leader of energies at IMCO. Oscar, the floor is yours for your comment. I thank you, Duncan. I thank Analina. Uh, and Duncan and the Wilson Center for being invited. Let me focus in the area of North America, how this reform of this reform initiative is not only impacting the competitiveness in the country, but also competitiveness at a regional level. We have a new free trade agreement, USMCA, that has many opportunity areas that will allow an integration of the productive chains, as it was mentioned in the first roundtable, ally shoring, near shoring, reshoring. And now in this historic the energy infrastructure of North America, IMCO, published in its International Competitiveness Index report called "The Map Has Been Changed. Mexico before the energy element in the 21st century." This is the new Persian Gulf in the area of energy. What was happening at that moment? At that moment, we had the boom of the gas and oil in Texas, also all of the oil sands in Mexico and Canada. And now we had the element of how this was going to be opening in Mexico and the world. This was previous to the constitutional amendment of December 2013. And 9 years later, we're having a conversation in a market where the decisions is not just a potential, it's a reality. And where Mexico is trying to be heading in a different direction, to go back to what we had before 2013, and not even before 2013, even before 1992, which makes it even more serious. And to consider how we can be more competitive with USMCA, if in 1994, what we had in NAFTA was not to reduce tariffs. For the first time, the parties and Mexico was committed to respect a series of disciplines and strict rules that were committed not to be changed. And for the first time, Mexico implemented the rule of law, at least in its economy. What was connected with international trade, let's say in 30% of its economy. And 28 years later, the main risk is that the Mexican state is sending a message that we are not committed with the rule of law. Beyond the cost of arbitration, of course, that is tremendously high, and the document sent by the commercial representative of the United States to the Ministry of Economy, to Tatiana Cloutier, is going to be a very hard language in this wording. And she talks about $10 billion in United States investments that are at risk given the energy reform initiative. And this is only the U.S. Perspective. But the Mexican energy sector, for example, and the electric sector, for example, has an important investment from Europe. Let's think about Spain, France, Italy also. So, well, the arbitration risk, without daring to mention a figure, it has to do with many variables, is considerably high and costly for Mexico state, and very costly, more so than several FOBAPROAs. But why are we involved in this? If the official narrative has been that the USMCA was not to take place because in 2018 the terms were renegotiated. This has been the official narrative. Chapter 8 of the USMCA says that we recognize the inalienable ownership of hydrocarbons by Mexico and its right to modify its constitution. This had needed not to be placed within the USMCA. All states have the right to amend its constitution, and constitutionally, Mexico is the owner of these hydrocarbons. But nevertheless, this is not a blank check. It is very important to highlight this. You know, Article 8 actually has two sections. The first says, yes, Mexico reserves its right to amend its constitution, but the second paragraph states that if we reserve this right without the fact that will be go against the rights of the parties, this is the member parties, United States and Canada as USMCA members. And we should also highlight that Chapter 8 of USMCA talks about hydrocarbons, not industrial processes. And we have to define that energy is not a natural resource. It's an industrial process, or energy generation or electric generation is an industrial process. And as such, it is not a part of this chapter, but is fully consolidated in different chapters that I will summarize to you briefly. First of all, the energy sector is consolidated from the NAFTA. Very little is mentioned about this because one of the elements that was revolutionary in NAFTA from 1994 was its symmetry. A country that was a developing economy had differentiated obligations compared with the developed parties, and in this case were Canada, the United States, and NAFTA was not the case. NAFTA was the first commercial agreement in which the non-developed party was committed to be respectful of the same level of efficiency that United States and Canada had. There was not a differentiated dealing. And the second was universality. This universality about NAFTA tells us that everything that is not strictly out of the treaty is a part of this, and an integrated part of this. And well, uh, now in this Crux clause, that is telling us that once a section opens unilaterally a sector, this sector goes to become consolidated in the element of the treaty. And this is precisely what happened with the openness that Mexico lived in a energy sector in 2014. So from Telecan, we have the investments in the energy sector with the dispute settlement chapter that I find it to be a very strict chapter in the protection of investments because it covers the national treatment of the most favored direct protection country. It has what in the international jargon is called as indirect expropriation. And well, 2016, Donald Trump wins the White House. The USMCA is being renegotiated. And how USMCA is opened. Chapter 8 does not talk about energy generation. Well, what we consider this openness remains. We cannot turn back this unilateral openness of the sector, yet at the same time, though the mechanism of dispute settlement is decaffeinated in relation to NAFTA, investors can have access to NAFTA because there is a transition mechanism for 3 years, therefore, as a mechanism after the implementation of USMCA. The investors can say that if they appeal to it will appeal to NAFTA or USMCA. So in 2023, investors can use the conditions established in NAFTA. Now, basically, uh, this is in Annex 14E. What is it telling us? That apart from the treatment of a national most progressive nation that is considered by USMCA, the direct expropriation that is out of the sectors remains for 6 sectors covered by contracts with the government, which is telecommunications, transportation, infrastructure, oil, gas, and energy or electric generation. So in the section of the rights of investors are fully protected at the United States, at the North American sector, and now the area regarding Sener, Mexico in the automotive sector. But it's a very modernizing, important element. And here we have, for example, Chapter 22 that talks about state-owned companies and the appointed monopoly, such as the use of networks, the transmission grid, the distribution grid, that are forced not to discriminate in favor of the role of the state. Of course, CFE. But this chapter is telling us that the companies that are state-owned have to operate under commercial considerations. This is something that clearly the energy initiative is not considering. Clearly, the mandate of the current CFE, this is chapter 4 of CFE, tells us that this mandate has to do with economic value generation for Mexico as the owner. The reform, one of the many changes is doing, is it gives CFE the right of operating with losses. I mean, it needs not to be a profitable company, and that goes against the chapter of the state. It also establishes independent regulation that at the moment that CFE was operating, participating in the relevant market, regulating and regulated, we're infringing directly this chapter. We also have the environment because, you know, the NAFTA originally had a bigger parallel in the environment. And Mexico was having this as an integrated part of its body. Now, the environmental chapter tells us that a party could lead to consulting processes with commercial sanctions possibilities if we attest that there is a systematic infringement to the national legislation in the environmental acts. There is a legislative element. Unless Mexico changes its environmental legislation, the energy legislation would not be compatible with the general act of climate change or the energy supply element. Just to mention 2 examples, there is another element that is opened by the Mexican government with this initiative. And beyond all of this, we have the issue of market access, also service supply and provision that will be clearly infringed if this reform is approved. And perhaps the most important thing is that the state mechanism where NAFTA had an original sin in the area of dispute settlement, that was that one party could avoid taking this to court. And they didn't, for example, I didn't like the panel member that you appointed. So the panel of arbitrators cannot be. The USMCA amended this, and we have a pre-selected panel member list that makes it impossible to veto the arbitration panels. We cannot block the arbitration panels. So the risk is not only in an arbitration process, there's a real risk of the state-to-state panels. And we go to the letter of the document sent by the ambassador, well, to all of the options that are presented by USMCA. This is not a complete list of where the infringements are taking place. And I'm forgetting something very important. Article 3211 is something strange. This is a full consideration of the reform at the USMCA. Article 3211 is telling us that in Mexico, not US and Canada, is committed in trade of energy and company-owned state to provide the same level of openness that has been given to other commercial uses in already ratified treaties. What is the implication of this? Well, it so happens that when USMCA has been signed, the TPAC of the trade agreement with the Pacific Alliance, what is consolidated in the annexes, the consolidation of the energy reform of 2013-2014. And just to mention that we are modernizing our commercial treatment with Mexico and the EU, where we also have the regulatory independence, regulating investments. So perhaps, if anything will end up to generate by this initiative is the very extensive and demanding network that Mexico has in the area of commercial international treaties. And if Mexico insists in going on with this, the consequences given the loss of reputation and also the economic losses given arbitrations and the non-received investment and the manufacturing and production, the exporting capacity loss, the increases of energy generation, well, the exports will be less competitive. And well, one more, the issue of taxes. There are serious discussions in the EU and the United States about certain type of carbon adjustments that will tax exports with a higher index, where Mexico will drop in regards to the adoption of this reform. This is the size of competitive risks for exporting and foreign investment of the Mexican economy. Thank you very much. We thank you for your ideas that are so clear in regards to your presentation. In order to conclude this panel, we will now give the floor to Luisa Sierra, the Energy Director of the Climate Initiative in Mexico. Luisa, you have the floor. Thank you, Duncan. I think someone will help me to share my screen. I was having problems, but this is my screen. Well, first of all, I thank México Evalúa, and Mexico Institute for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share this panel with with the other speakers and our moderator. I will talk to you precisely about competitiveness in general terms and how renewable energies had a positive impact in the energy prices, in the transmission, and the space proposed in terms of costs. Well, next slide, please. When we have a market, and here we have this line in general terms, this is a control elements by CFE. Now this makes CFE to have the power to establish prices and other factors. And it generates the fact that the company does not have cash to grow, and it therefore has to reduce its cost. The 2013 reform opened the market to competition by attracting companies that can provide the same level of service with higher efficiency and lesser cost. In theory, this is a sector we have a higher number of participants, and it will be therefore a more efficient sector. So competition will make or give way to a reduction of prices. So the concentration of a market will give us a general idea of what is the level of competence in the same market. So the ICM conducted a simple analysis to see what was the concentration level in the wholesale market. And well, we had the IHH, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, to see what was the participation of the companies, how much a company can connect the system and fix or set prices at a higher value. We have greater competition. The index obtained for Mexico was 1,920. This value tells us very little unless we have a comparative. In a very quick way, a comparative with the UK is a system which is one of the most open systems in the world that has a value of 1,000. This tells us that in Mexico, well, we do have competence, but we can still increase this. And one of the main reasons for this, given why we have this value, is if each of the subsidiaries of the Federal Commission will concentrate an important market participation, even though they're separated. As a matter of fact, if we bring together the subsidiaries of generation of CFE, this value will go up to 5,300. This could facilitate the CFA could set prices and up also to a certain level to manipulate the order of this merit. So the 2013 reform, it is not perfect as it has been mentioned, but it has increased the competitiveness and also increased the efficiency within this area. And these renewable energies have played a critical role in this and also within the market. Well, I will speak about this in my next slide. Now, as you may see on the screen, well, when I talk about competitiveness, well, we have to talk about prices. So one of the elements that has influenced price energies has to do with the renewable energy penetration, the approval of the energy reform, and how this renewable energy publication had a significant element. They went from 3.7% of generation on a yearly basis in 2013 to a 14.5 in 2021. This, together with the hydroelectric and nuclear energy that we have given way to the fact that in 2021 we will achieve for the first time to be above the 30% of clean generation in the country. As you may see on the graphs in 2018, when precisely the renewable energy penetration started becoming meaningful given the major construction project, the emissions of the energy sector went down, and this reduction remained in future years. It's important to mention that this is happening with a growing demand that is found around 3 point and a bit on a yearly basis, or even it goes down a bit. So it's about 3%. In regards to the long-term auctions that took place in 2015, 2016, and 2017, most of the projects managed to start operating in 2018 and 2020. This gave way, among other benefits, a reduction in the energy prices, and also we will see this next. Now, the next slide, please. Well, where can we see how effectively the prices, the energy prices went down? As we can see, the local marginal prices. These are taken from 3.20, which is a major component, and it has to do with the economic dispatch given the merit order, and now marginal element and generation that has to do with the limitations of transmission of the system. If we don't have enough transmission capacities, to have plants that were not dispatched during the first interaction, and the component of loss of marginal loss, which is also for each node, and it's up to the losses of energy in which we fall in leading. When we have the transmission corridors, we heat up uh, the conductors and we lose energy. So we analyze the component of the energy, which is the blue line of the PML. Well, we can realize how this has been downsizing because renewable energies have been penetrating the system and have displaced inefficient technologies and polluting energy sources. You can see this on the screen below the green curve. This is the renewable generation in the country. So as we can see within the graph, the maximum average price on a monthly basis took place in May of 2018 with a value of 2,359 pesos per megawatt hour, and such price went down within 1 year in a value of 9,965 megawatts per hour. The same can be seen in the minimum monthly basis that took place in January 2019 with a value of 1,205, and it went down to 541 pesos in January of 2020. Here we can see how renewable energies and the market has managed to downsize or reduce prices. Now, within the reform is concerning in many senses that it assigns CFE the implementation and the transmission of energy and the generation of 54%, while the company is not only have developed 0.74% of the renewable capacity installed in the country. For 2024, CFE, as we all know, has foreseen to redirect to 140 megas of hydroelectric and put in place 120 megas of the first section of the Sonora project, the solar project. And between 2024 and 2030, CFE will only consider an addition of 880 megas of photovoltaic capacity. Well, this will make us get 2030 with only 8.5% of renewable energy sources capacity, and that is the total renewable situation for that year. Next slide, please. Well, now going back to the energy prices, which is important to mention that in the lack of investment gives way that not all of the system uh, will be benefiting from the penetration of renewable energies and the transmission of costs. The lack of transmission capacity to the Yucatan Peninsula cannot be taking the produced electricity in clean and cheaper way, and it will be important to switch its most inefficient and polluting centrals in the peninsula. Within the slide, you can see the comparative of the PMLs in 3 different nodules. the reference, which is the Monclova, Querétaro, and the Mayan Riviera. And we can see the increase in the Mayan Riviera with the years and the high volatility, the yellow color. You can identify it. This goes up to 15,000 pesos a megawatt per hour. This variation in comparison to the other nodules, mainly it has to do with a component of marginal congestion and marginal losses component. Now, in the energy is equal for all the nodes of the system. This tells us that the Riviera Maya will be mainly affected given the transmission, and it is in agreement with the national transmission grid that later on I will be showing you later on. Next slide, please. Now, given in terms of transmission, the reform is not considering changes within the transmission of how they're going to be considering this problem. We have no idea, officially speaking. Now, even the last element considers the additions up to 2024 and the future years that increases the risk and the intensity of contingencies, but also the loss of competitiveness within the system, because we need the incorporation of additional actors, as you may see for the transmission element in the next slide. These are the two critical points that we have that have been identified for a long time in the northeastern part of the country and the southeastern part of the country, where there's no way to give a way out to the energy, given the way in which the transmission network is been installed. Next point, another issue that is relevant within the proposed reform is the dispatch order. The dispatch order, the reform is not considering this. There was an official communique issued by the Energy Ministry that showed the new dispatch order. This is what you can see on the screen. I would not go into technical terms of why this is not viable dispatch, but I will also mention that it commits and compromises the system's stability. Now, in this regard, when we're talking about competitiveness, NREL, the energy Clean Laboratory conducted a study where it conducted a model of the order of dispatch to give priority to CFE, and they identified through different scenarios that will increase the cost of energy production between 31 to 42%. And this difference was going to be increasing, going up to $13 billion. Now the natural gas consumption will be up in 6 to 29%. The use of fuel oil between 824% to 1,110%. This is quite alarming given the impact that it has fuel oil on health, and coal will be up to 47 to 130%. What is this telling us in environmental terms? Next slide, please. Well, in environmental terms, the CO2 emissions will go up in 26.85%. The emissions of sulfur dioxide will go up in 123% and 256%. This has impacts and severe affectations on the health of the inhabitants that are live close to hydroelectric plants. And also it is and also we have the rainfall component that will be impacting the ecosystem. Also the emissions of nitrogen or emissions that will go up from 93 to 93, 47 to 93%. This has impacts in the health of the population. And it also considering the creation and diminution of the ozone layer. To conclude my intervention, the reform initiative commits and compromises the reliability and the competitiveness of the sector. And by the end of the story, it will have repercussions among all of us citizens. And also we are not compromising with the international agreements such as the Paris Accord, and this is hurting all of us. To establish a dialogue like this one and to listen to different proposals of how we can have a counter reform in place and have a dialogue among all of the stakeholders, and its inclusion is very important. It's important to build upon the right points that have been touched by different panels and even this one of the reform, but also to identify the opportunity windows, such as not to include in the design of the reform the social component, which is a key element for a real fair energy transition. There are new business models that give room for this. So, well, this is all I wanted to share with you. And I thank you so much for the time allocated. We thank you, Luisa, and we thank you for the MREL report data that is telling me that it is so very important that we will have all the R&D and all the publications that have to be published by independent agencies, also within independent government, and also what can have an impact here. I have one question for the three panel members, and then we will have one specific question. We have limited time, so let me read very quickly. The first question: the opposition expressed 12 points for its own reform. Morena is willing to integrate some of the points of this private, which you consider that these points could be able to have in common, and that could be a part of this final initiative if each of you could just be mentioned to what one point. The first specific question for Ana Lilia. This comes from the audience. Now, the auctions to migrate and self-supply to the PS and other legated schemes will be with the intention of strengthening the basic supply, that is the basic supply to small consumers. A second question for Oscar. Oscar, a bit about North America international trade. Basically, today with USMCA is very important. There is a type of cognitive dissonance, a conflict among the perspective of President López Obrador in regards to the USMCA and also its perspective in the energy. For many years in Mexico, we had this conflict too. When we had NAFTA, energy was not included in on the case of Mexico. How do you explain this conflict in AMLO's way of thinking, and what could be the settlement or the solution of this? And finally, for Luisa, the decision of the Mexican government that puts so much highlight in the hydroelectric energy. What is wrong about it? Many years ago, the government of Mexico took the decision, very important decision, of focusing its renewable energy policies in the renewable energy sources that are non-hydroelectric. Why not to include hydroelectric energy? Why don't we start with Ana Lilia? I thank you, Duncan. I have a question. Your voice, when you started your question. Now, is this proposal will benefit the basic supply? Is that your question? I didn't get your question directly. Would it be with the intention of strengthening the basic supply? Yes, thank you. The idea of strengthening the wholesale energy market is to benefit the end consumer in all its modes. Currently, as I have shared with you, the system has a coexistence or of old systems or old regimes and the new regime. This is shown in the end fees. We have fees that are subject to economic competition within the supply of qualified suppliers where the major consumers are, and they enjoy competitive fees. But we also have another part of the market that remains being subject to regulated fees that are determined from the Ministry of the Treasury and the Regulatory Energy Commission, and that do not necessarily reflect the cost of the system. As a matter of fact, this fee is indexed to inflation. That's quite dangerous because during inflation terms, the fee will be going up. This proposal, what is implying is that the benefit of the marginal local cost, which are the prices of the market, of the wholesale market, will benefit, and also the auction will benefit all consumers equally. Thank you. Excellent. Oscar.
Yo diría que la principal
I would say that the most important thing for the electric system to work right is to have a truly independent regulator, viable and robust. So along this sense, perhaps the most important thing that is proposed by the initiative, not only one of the 12 points, is precisely the independence of the Regulatory Energy Commission. The presidential initiative wants to vanish this, but perhaps here we can have a different element. They are positions that we cannot match. The fact of the transmission of CFE to become more independent, that is very different to reconcile. Also issuing permits, for example, what will be discussed this next Monday, perhaps that could be something to be incorporated, but this is not a substantial change of the initiative. The most important element has to do with the full independence of the regulatory commission, because a regulator is not only what has to do with the state, but also with the private sector. I think that in the long term is the most important thing. So we will, because everything we need is not a legal reform. All we need is regulatory creativeness to implement, as Ana Lilia was saying, the area of the energy auctions in order to fully implement what the Mexican energy sector needs. That is not only a constitutional reform. And now the question that I find quite fun of this tension in the vision of López Obrador in regards to USMCA and the energy sector. Let us recall that López Obrador in the 90s was someone who directly opposed to the commercial openness and, of course, to the free trade agreement. But nevertheless, conditions change because now, on the one side, López Obrador sees USMCA as a value of stability. There are certain things that limit López Obrador. The exchange rate is one of them, and the other one is USMCA. So I believe that this is something that moderates the current administration, because let us recall that USMCA is a legacy of López Obrador, who ended up with this negotiation was López Obrador. And this is one of the most positive elements of his administration as a legacy. And I believe that the president sees the renegotiation as USMCA as part of his legacy. And I think that this is why he's moderating his actions in regards to the energy sector at the USMCA. That is quite clear and direct. And the energy for the current public administration has to be understood from its origins. The president had a political training with an ideology, and that tension will always be present. We are we are losing Oscar. We are unable to follow Oscar because his internet connection was not good enough. Your internet I have technical problem. Well, at the end, the relevance of USMCA will be far more important than the ideology, and to concentrate everything within CFA and Pemex. Well, to conclude, let me give the floor to Luisa. Well, I thank you, Duncan. Well, yes, precisely. In regards to the first question regarding what is it that could remain on the table, I would say I would say the how. I totally agree with Ana Lilia in regards to self-employed and PS, and we have to see how we can migrate these to the market. That is very important. But nevertheless, I would not take as the reform is expressing it. On the other hand, I think it's important to see how we can strengthen the Federal Commission, but I do not believe that is necessary to its integration in a vertical way and to create a monopoly as the one that has been proposed. So let us see these elements now of the reform proposed. I will not take it any of the proposals as such. I think that those 2 points are key points
that we can see that they are under discussion in other counter proposals that have been disseminating. Now, in the hydro energy sources, that is not wrong. I mean, this is a very positive technology used as a basis because it has a quicker response possibility, and it can be used for storage as a reserve given the rises and drops of the demand or possible failures. Hydro energy sources are necessary. The potential in Mexico has been quite advantageous for Mexico, but hydro energy has an environmental impact, more so if we consider the full life cycle of this technology that upsets ecosystems. So yes, it's positive. It has been utilized. I'm not saying that it is not necessary. As a matter of fact, there is a certain limit of hydro that we are close to it. There are some small hydroelectrical plants. What we should do is to improve the performance of the existing hydros, but this is not going to be enough. It is not enough to decarbonize the sector, and it's not a solution to keep the low cost of the system. There are cheaper technologies that can come in to supply energy than if we operate the system in the adequate way with the support of storage. We can have a very highly flexible, efficient, and low-cost system. I'm speaking, for example, of solar and wind energy sources with a tremendous potential that they should play a role that is far more important than what they're currently playing in our country. We thank you, Luisa. Let me congratulate all of the wonderful panel members for this excellent discussion. And now let me give the floor to Edna. Well, my comments of this second table and to the event that we have had this morning are that we have strong, hard evidence uh, and that allows no argument that the model that we wanted to build with the 2013 reform has virtues. The market does allocate things. The market does give room to produce with lesser weights and costs. It gives room for cleaner energy sources. So within the model that we wish for the energy sector, what was discussed in the 2013, I believe that this reform is compliant with these goals. But I believe that it did not solve the political problem. That is what I was sharing in the previous table. We can have all of the technical arguments, and they have been expressed in both roundtables. Our speakers have been very clear, and they have brought evidence very well operated, but we're not solving the political issue. So the political issue is associated with the fact that the CFE must continue having a relevant role in the energy sector. That is why we have redefined this as a state productive, state-owned company. Tony Payan mentioned this, to separate the state from a state-owned company, give it a corporative administration and the mandate to generate competitiveness. I believe that the model was complete, but these models do not always react to reality. Now, the crux of things now is a political issue. And I believe that your question of how we can make viable to support the very best of the 2013 reform, but to make it political viable has to do with CFE, redefine its vocation of how we can make it profitable, how we can reformulate its corporative governance. So then, Duncan, I believe that the way I identify this as a major topic, I would like to organize with you a following roundtable where we will talk about this topic. Hopefully, the political timing will allow us to have a discussion of this nature. That policy will not overwhelm evidence nor techniques or vice versa. We need that technical issues will be served politics, and we have to assume technical criteria by the policies because this will render the best possible social outcome of the interaction among all of us. So then I have absolutely loved this morning's discussion, as I also have valued that México Evalúa has been a part of the open parliament discussion. I am fully convinced that it is through the discussion, the presentation of evidence, the generation of substantial discussions, the only way that we will find the common ground to build the future energy and electric landscape that we need in the future. We don't have to kill the country to retain a company. Let us save a company that is called to play a very relevant role. Well, we thank you, Edna, and I fully agree with your comments. I have received many questions. All of this event has been recorded, so you can find it in our websites. And also we will be able to include many of the presentations that have been shared with you in these two roundtables. To conclude, I was before the Senate and the Energy Committee, and we had a 21st century in given access to critical views in the energy reform. The politicians such as South Dakota, West Virginia, Nevada, and others, they are all focused in the energy transition here within this process. In Mexico, we're still focused in questions and areas of energies of the 20th century. We have to change this. That is why it is so very important, as it has been mentioned, to have this type of conversation. That is why it's so very important to have more research, more data, so we can, little by little, consider the opinion of the elites and also the public opinion. We thank you so much for your participation. Edna, with great pleasure, we'll organize another roundtable regarding the topics that you have mentioned, and we shall meet again soon. Thank you very much.